Disclaimer, this video obviously contains spoilers and I'm not gonna explain JoJo because it's JoJo. Go search up some other YouTubers, they 100% do a better job than me. Also, I'm not gonna go through part 1, 6, 7, and 8. Part 1, I'm not gonna go through it because it's part 1, and who could forget fights such as Jonathan versus Dio, Jonathan versus Dio, and Jonathan versus Dio. At least for part 2, the fights in this part were way more memorable, thanks of course to Joseph himself. And although the battles here are not near the caliber of the later parts, it's still pretty impressive. But for me, the fight that was the most memorable was definitely the Joseph versus Wamuu fight. Due in part to the fact that this is the most Joseph Joestar is in this fight. His dumb luck, and of course his outplays. And with this fight coming right after Wamuu flattening Caesar Animal Kaiser style, I was expecting Joseph to go all out once he defeated Wamuu, but no, Joseph actually had respect for him and honored him. And honor is not exactly the perfect word to describe Joseph. The crossbow and divine sandstorm counter outplay I really enjoyed, and Wamuu and Joseph I felt was the most fitting matchup. Okay, next please.
I cannot hit your shit without getting close to you.
Oh, then get closer to you as you wish.
Part 3, moving from Hamon and into stands. Stands were probably the aspect that made JoJo so popular in the first place. Hamon was interesting, but stands could be infinitely more fun and unique. The creativity with the design, the abilities, and most importantly, the fights were out of this world. So for part 3, there were a whole lot of contenders, since in almost every episode there was some sort of conflict, so there were bound to be a few really exciting ones. Off the top of my head, you have Polnareff versus Ebony, Jotaro versus Yellow Temperance, Jotaro versus Anubis, Jotaro versus the two Darby brothers, Polnareff and Kakyoin versus Whole Horse and Hanged Man, and Jotaro versus Steely Dan, all of which were one of the many highlights of part 3 for me. But the most exceptional one, and in my opinion, one of the most underrated, was definitely the Polnareff versus Vanilla Ice. Serving as a sort of appetizer, it's often overshadowed by the finale of Dio versus Jotaro, and for good reasons. I mean, the finale fight had the visuals, the build-up, and most importantly, the memes. However, for me, the Polnareff versus Vanilla Ice was the one that felt like a genuine fight between two people who just absolutely despise each other. Despite the two characters having little to no history between them, it strangely had the most emotion as well. Out of all the minor antagonists that part 3 had, Vanilla Ice 100% took the cake for how insane and obsessed he was with Dio. Sound familiar or not? Okay, I'm sorry. Anyways, which led to probably the most violent death in the whole series. And we have Polnareff, who had the two characters he had the most conflict with die in front of him. And we also get to see how he reacts to it. Avdol had to save him again, which led to Avdol dying again for real. You can really hear the anguish and the pain and the hate that Polnareff has in his voice when he was confronting Vanilla Ice. And Polnareff also realizes how he actually liked Iggy at the end. And on another note, I think Iggy got an okay send-off with how much he changed compared to when he was first introduced, especially when we got to see the two of them partnering up in this fight. I also just think Polnareff is the best character in part 3 and has the coolest stand among the whole Crusaders. Polnareff definitely got the most character development, and Jotaro gets better in part 4 and 6, but I wouldn't say he was the best in his own part. And of course, how Polnareff kills Vanilla Ice has got to be, without a doubt, the most badass thing I've seen in the whole series. Hell, maybe even for any fight in anime. A simple shoulder nudge and a curse. Oh my god. Even though you could say that technically Hanged Man was Polnareff's Dio, since that was the main reason why Polnareff decided to tag along the rest of the Crusaders, I'd consider this to be Polnareff's true ending in part 3.
But this would happen. Why does this always happen? I think I'm gonna have a breakdown!
Coming off the action-filled Part 3, Part 4 seems more tame in comparison. With it being more akin to a slice of life, you wouldn't really associate Part 4 with that many good fights. You, of course, would be absolutely wrong because it is still filled to the brim with quality. Although I will admit some of the stands have kinda obscure abilities like the Lock and Cinderella, still, the stands in this series are among my favorites. For example, Crazy Diamond, The Hand, and Heaven's Door. What about the fights? Okay, let's talk about them. So, to list a quick few right off the bat, Josuke versus Rohan, Josuke and Okuyasu versus Superfly, Rohan versus Cheap Trick, Yuya versus Enigma, Koichi and Jotaro versus Sheer Heart Attack, and of course, Josuke versus Yoshikage Kira. However, for me, there is one clear-cut winner that stands among the rest. That is Josuke versus Yuya Fungami. If I were to give an example of a fight where it perfectly showed the ability of a stand, this would be the fight. I feel like Crazy Diamond's biggest weakness is that if he's confined to one place, he can only really use his rebuilding ability on the things that are available, which may lead to some fights where Josuke only really uses it once or twice, like the Superfly fight. Not saying I want him to use it like every single available second, and I still like Superfly, but still. With the setting of the fight constantly moving around, it allows Josuke to use more of his abilities since he isn't really constricted to a single battlefield, even though technically he only really uses it like 3 times. But every time he uses it, each time it showed the extent of his powers. Okay, number 1, he can instantly break down something and restore it just as fast. Number 2, if he has a piece of something, he can bring the rest of that thing to him, like the motorcycle part. Number 3, he can't heal himself. Number 4, he can punch really, really fast. I guess the only part where Josuke doesn't show another part of his ability was the fact that he can morph and manipulate people into inanimate objects like rocks and books. Okay, maybe in some other fights, Josuke exhibited more of his abilities. Let me know cause I may be completely wrong. But even still, this would still be my pick. I also really admire Yuya Fungami. I think his stand character is super underrated and I was pleasantly surprised to see him again. Also, correct me if I'm wrong, but apart from Rohan, wasn't he the only minor antagonist that turned good that had his own solo fight? Oh yeah, the fight itself with Enigma is also solid. I know I said Polnareff's fight had the most badass ending, but this fight also had an extremely fun one as well. Josuke fixing Yuya so that he can beat his ass is such a clever way to make sure a villain gets his due. Not to mention Josuke's team building up with Yuya's slow realization. It's one of the best moments of Part 4. Moving on to Part 5, in terms of fights and battles, this part is arguably the most violent one, and as a result, it has really thrilling fights. I think it has to do with the fact that the stands, both main cast and villains, have so many interesting concepts with them. Apart from the babyface fight, I would say all the La Squadra fights were at least a 7.5 out of 10. Even the other antagonists like Chocolata and Psycho were pretty good. Aerosmith, Sex Pistols, Purple Haze and Sticky Fingers were fantastic as well. If I had to choose, I'd probably pick between Giorno and Mista versus White Album, Giorno versus Chocolata, Bruno versus Oasis, and Bruno versus Pesci and Prosciutto. I think my choice would probably be Bruno versus Pesci and Prosciutto. Even though I will admit nearly half the fight is just them talking amongst themselves, and it does span over like 3 episodes, but still, I think this fight was still pretty banger. I actually kinda like Bruno more than I thought I did. He's the most serious in the main crew like Avdol and Joseph in the first few episodes of Stardust Crusaders. But unlike the two of them, Bruno stays like this the whole way and has a stand that's actually used more than one fight. I'm sorry Avdol, but they definitely did you dirty. Anyways, back on track. It's about time since we had an actual Bruno fight. Even though I think Narancia and Mista had the cooler stand overall, I couldn't really stand Narancia in fights, and Mista's presence was becoming a bit excessive at this point. So I'm thankful that Bruno got the spotlight for this one. The enemy stands also surprised me. Like, when I first saw Pesci's Beach Boy, I thought it was gonna be pretty weak, but it's actually one of the more deadlier stands in La Squadra, and it was refreshing to see a duo of villains. I liked Pesci's brief development from being a sort of panicky guy to a stone-cold killer, and their relationship kind of reminded me of Okuyasu and Nishijima, and by their I mean Pesci and Prosciutto, with the more mature brother dying and the younger one who relied on them so much having to sort of take matters into their own hands. Or maybe it's because Pesci kept calling Prosciutto bro. That could be it. Also, I mean, do I really need to talk about the ending? Look, man, Giorno may have his 7-page Muda, but seeing Pesci into little zipper pieces, as Bruno says. Now, that's a whole nother level.